Tell us about the origination of the Burton History Tree. I know we're looking at the original title. Tell us a little bit about where it came from and where you came up with this.
Well, I've been a big rock and roll fan, and the situation was back in the mid '70s or so. There wasn't a whole lot of people correlating the trends and the history of music. Groups were coming out, music was being played, and you couldn't distinguish if it was British or European or American or whatever. And I wanted to find out if there were correlations that you could put together and make a concise, a graphic representation of music. And I got a lot of information, read a lot of stuff. And so one day I was going to do one on British music because it wasn't as expansive as American music was, and so forth, and its lineages. So the limit, really British rock and roll probably was an early to mid '60s phenomenon. And again, the Beatles and the Stones and the Animals and so forth were the ones that we were exposed to. But there's another hidden underground of British music that most people inside of America, let's use America, that really they didn't realize existed. So I try to make correlations and try to find out who were the people that were important, and obviously the Beatles and the Stones were obviously the first to make an inroad in this, and there were a lot of smaller bands.
Well, I'm sorry but what about the actual tree? This Burton History Tree. How did this take shape?
Well, yeah, the situation with the using a tree is that the typical family tree is something that you have two people and they get married and they have kids, and then their kids have kids, and they die and they marry other people and so forth. But I really didn't feel that as a graphic was something that would catch the imagination of the public. So I decided to use the family tree concept, and actually use a tree. And instead of going from the top and going downward, I tried to do it like a tree would grow. And you'd have a roots where music was originated, and here you have Elvis and the Everly Brothers and the blues influences and so forth that influenced many of the major early bands. And then you got into the trunk, and then you started to see who were the major players as far as what was happening in British music. And then after you establish that, then you try to branch off into the different types of music, rock and roll or heavy metal or blues or folk and traditional and pop and psychedelic, and then the newer stuff, up in here, the new wave sounds and so forth, and try to do that and try to give, so when somebody looked at it, their eyes were all over the place because they were looking for their favorite bands, trying to find out, and then using the logos off their albums, which also helped make the represent what was really going on in the music scene at the time. Now again, this was the late '70s music when I first did this, and when I first did that, that's what I had to work with, and so now I have an unlimited amount of material that I could use for a second or an update of a tree.
So this is the second update of the British tree.
Right. This going up to about 1990.
And then, but in terms of where did you come up with this concept? What was the flash of genius that said, I'm gonna make this?
I sat down and I was coaching physical education. I was coaching swimming at the high school level and at the AAU level. But again, I had just gotten married, and I needed, but I still had this desire.
What year is this?
1978.
Okay.
That I had this desire to always create things, make something. I was combining my love and interest for music along with my graphic skills. Now this originally was done on one sheet of illustration board. There was no playing and picking up and moving, guys. When it was down, it was down. And so I had to live with that concept that whatever I put down was going to remain there. And then as my graphic art skills increased, I was able to do many other different things in that aspect. But as far as this, I would find a logo that was representative of the band, and off one of their albums, if they did not have a representative logo that I could live with, then I created one that kind of represented the time that they were, in vogue.
And why sports? I know you do sports as well. Why sports? Why music?
Well, I think people lose the overall picture of something. When you look at one of my prints, you want to see as much of the history as possible so you can correlate it. Some people and when I did the Bears tree, people are only interested in the 80s, 90s Bears. But the Bears were one of the successful franchises in all of the history of the NFL. Here, I'm trying to bring to light a lot of bands that not only were big in England and were big here, but were big over there that did not make an impact over here. So I'm just giving everybody what I always look at it as a one-page history book. You look at it, and most of the major groups of importance or people or subject matter is represented in a way that you can hang it on your wall, and it can become it's always become a conversation piece. So
how do people react, and what do they tell you more than anything else about?
Well, when I first did the drawing of this tree, people said the first thing was, how can I get a copy of it? And of course I didn't, being in a totally different world of teaching physical education and coaching kids, I did not know what the next step was, but we found a printer and they explained the procedure, and my first printing, I printed out 2,000 of these trees in a much larger format, only because I didn't realize that the bigger something is, the harder it is to frame and display. So over the years, I've tried to make my artworks standardized so that you can put them in something that doesn't overwhelm your wall.
And what is the main idea that somebody should take away from in looking
Well,
at this?
that everything, and as any subject matter, some things hold up better than others. Some people hold their importance and their sway over the subject matter sometimes much longer than others. Others are just having what Andy Warhol said, with 15 minutes of fame. Here, you get your 15 minutes of fame. This goes up to 1990. If I added the groups from the 90s and the first decade of the new millennium, things could change dramatically. And in my mind, many of the groups that you see on this tree may not come to fruition on the next edition of this tree.
So what is your vision for this art? And I know you started with sports, and I know you started with music, and I know you moved into sports, and now
Well,
now we've got BurtonHistoryTrees.com. What is your vision? Where do you see
well,
this going?
I think we could almost take any subject matter, and as long as it has some kind of quantitative stuff that we can base big, small, large, small, or just being on the tree, we can do it. It could be, I dabbled in the tree of Hollywood, or the tree of the Broadway, or the trees that are even in another genre other than music and sports. But almost anything, history of the 20th century, history of just 1 year. You could break down anything into a concise, interesting graphic which tells you a story of a time or a place that sometimes rush by people. And as I get older, unfortunately, my closeness to the subject matter, mainly music, has been waning, because, again, things that I was brought up on is the base that everything is listened to now. And technology has enabled many people in the world to become so-called artists. And everybody has a little moment in the sun. And unfortunately, I have to evaluate that moment and see if it's worthy to be put on a artwork that has only a finite amount of information that can be put on before it becomes very difficult to read.
So do you have any advice for artists or entrepreneurs that are maybe looking to get into either the business world or the art world?
Well, I think people have got to look outside of the box. They've got to make something that has an appeal outside of the art world, but combines the music or the sports. But you have to think outside of the box. And I feel kind of sorry for many kids nowadays and young people, because the unfortunate thing is that computers can make this world very accessible, but also it can take away from it, because it does block that thinking, block the vision that comes with pure thought, and sometimes that gets lost in that process.